Welcome back to Macro Unit 3. We're going to look at the aggregate supply curve in this lesson. So what is aggregate supply? It's all the supply curves added together. So it's the amount of goods and services that firms are willing to produce at different price levels. The aggregate supply curve is the supply of everything by all firms, okay? And the aggregate supply is a little bit trickier than aggregate demand because it differentiates between the short run and the long run. So there are actually two different aggregate supply curves, okay? In the short run aggregate supply, we are going to assume that wages and resource prices will not increase as price level increases, okay? So in the short run, wages and resource prices are fixed, okay? However, in the long run, we're going to assume that wages and resource prices will increase as price level increases. Okay, so in other words, the short run aggregate supply period is the fixed wage period, whereas the long run aggregate supply period is the variable wage period. Okay, let's do a little analysis as to why in the short run, wages are going to stay fixed, but in the long run, they may not, and therefore the incentives for firms are going to change. Let's imagine a firm's currently making 100 units and they're sold for $1 each. Let's assume they only have one cost, and that's labor, and their labor costs are 80 bucks. So how much is the profit for that firm? Well, the profit is 20 bucks. $100 in revenue minus $80 in cost equals $20 in profit. In the short run, if the price level doubles, what's going to happen for this firm? Well, if the price level goes up, now they're going to still produce 100 units for $2. So their total revenue becomes $200. What's their profit now? Their profit's $120. $200 total revenue minus $80 in labor costs equals $120. So as you can see, with those higher profits, firms are going to have an incentive to increase production. Because those wages stayed the same, profit has gone way up. So this firm and their competitors are getting signals to produce more because the profits have increased so much. Okay, so let's derive that curve. What is that going to mean? That means price level goes up, then the quantity supplied is going to go up. So our aggregate supply curve is going to look like a traditional supply curve. It's going to show that direct relationship between price level and real GDP supply. Okay, so that's a short run aggregate supply curve. Okay. On the other hand, in the long run, so say over many, many years, wages and resource prices are going to increase as price level increases as well. So let's take that same firm and see what would happen to them in the long run. The firm has a total revenue of 100 bucks and uses $80 of labor, their profit's going to be 20. In the long run, what's going to happen if the price level doubles? Well, total revenue is going to increase to $200. However, in the long run, workers are going to demand higher wages to match those price increases. So your labor cost is going to double to 160. So our profit, our nominal profit is up to 40, but the real profit is unchanged because all prices in the economy doubled. So therefore, the purchasing power of our profit is exactly the same. So real profit did not change. Therefore, this firm has no incentive to increase output. So we have no incentive to produce more because the profit is going to be fixed in the long run. So what does that tell us about our long run aggregate supply curve? Okay, if price level doesn't impact it, then it's going to be fixed at a certain quantity. So our LARS curve, which is our long run aggregate supply curve, is going to be vertical as opposed to the short run curve. And it's going to be vertical at a very particular GDP. It's going to be vertical at our trend line, at our potential output, at our full employment output. And what we're going to assume is that in the long run, the economy will be producing at full employment. And that's an idea that we've expressed with the business cycle trend line, right? We're going to have these ebbs and flows, but eventually we're going to settle along that full employment output. That's the same as the LARS curve in the ASAD model. Okay, now we're going to keep developing this and practicing with it, so don't get overwhelmed yet, but that's the reason that we have two curves. Okay, the LARS curve is going to be vertical at the full employment trend line. So let's look at shifting the short run aggregate supply curve. So right now we're going back to the short run curve, and we're going to analyze what's going to increase to the right or decrease to the left. The acronym to remember this is RAP, or RAP. Okay, and you'll see why I chose RAP in a couple more lessons. But the acronym to remember this in your mind is RAP, RAP. Okay, so if we have an increase or decrease in the national production, that can shift AD to the right, to the right or to the left. All right, so let's go through those categories of changes so we're ready to practice. R stands for resource prices. If there's a change in resource prices, that can increase aggregate demand to the right or decrease aggregate demand to the left. Okay. And these can be resources that are from domestically produced or imported. If there's an increase in the price of Canadian lumber, that's going to decrease aggregate supply. If there's a decrease in the price of Chinese steel, that's going to increase aggregate supply. So if resources get cheaper, aggregate supply increases. If resources get more expensive, aggregate supply decreases. Okay. A term you want to look out for related to this are going to be supply shocks. So if there's a negative supply shock, that means by definition, the aggregate supply curve is shifting to the left. And if there's a positive supply shock, aggregate supply curve is shifting to the right. Okay. The most famous negative supply shock in history was the US oil embargo in the 1970s, which created a negative supply shock in the whole economy as a result of that shortage of oil. Inflationary expectations matter on the aggregate supply curve model, okay? If people expect higher prices in the future, here's what they're gonna do. Now pay attention because this is often not as intuitive for students. If producers expect higher prices in the future, their workers are gonna demand higher wages, and therefore their costs are going to increase. So, and if there are inflationary expectations, that's going to decrease aggregate supply because workers are going to demand higher wages, and wages are resource costs. So the AS is going to shift to the left. The second category are actions of the government. So in the RAP acronym, A stands for actions. This is not government spending. So these are other policies of the government, but that are not related to government spending, because government spending is an expenditure. So it's going to shift the aggregate demand curve. Okay. Taxes on producers can also impact the aggregate supply curve. Okay. If we lower corporate taxes, that's going to increase aggregate supply. If you lower corporate taxes, that's going to increase aggregate supply because all other things equal, instead of sending that money to the government, it's going to be used to buy fixed and variable resources to produce more. Subsidies for domestic producers can impact the AS curve. So if we lower the subsidies for domestic farmers, that's going to decrease aggregate supply. Okay, and then government regulations can impact aggregate supply as well. Okay, so if the EPA requires new inspections to operate a farm, that's going to decrease aggregate supply because businesses need to use resources to comply with those inspections, and that's going to decrease aggregate supply. Okay. And then the third category is going to be a change in productivity. So RAP, P stands for productivity. So if there are major technological breakthroughs across the whole society, that's going to change productivity. And on the other hand, you can get a negative supply shock as a result of that as well. So if a computer virus destroys half of all the computers in the United States, that's going to decrease aggregate supply because you'd get a huge negative productivity shock. Okay. On the other hand, if down there at the MIDI Robotics Lab, they invented a brand new teleportation machine, then that would drastically increase productivity of companies across the whole economy, and that would increase aggregate supply to the right. Okay, so those are the shifters of aggregate supply, and we will keep building this model and put AS and AD together next time. Enjoy the rest of your day.